All right. Episode 8 of the Manage to Win podcast. We have John Jackson of William Jessup University. John, thanks for being here with us.
Thanks so much. It's always a privilege.
Can you go into your background a little bit, just what you do at William Jessup? You're the president of the university. You have a big role to fill right there.
Yeah, it's been an interesting challenge. Sometimes people describe their lives as a straight line, but if that were the description, that would not be mine. I never intended to be a college president, but in a series of circumstances, March 2011, I became college president. So I'm finished now officially with my 8th year, beginning my 9th year. I can hardly imagine that as I say it. And being a president of a university is a little bit like running the United Nations and a small city at the same time.
How so?
How so? Well, I'll tell you what, with the United Nations, you presumably have people who want to be amicable, but on the one hand, they all have competing interests. And that's a little bit what I've discovered between a combination of academics and student life and our development or fundraising arm and all the various component parts that sometimes a challenge. They're all awesome people, but they have competing interests. And then the small city is that sometimes it's the little things. I remember my first week here, I had students come up to me asking, really almost begging, can you fix the potholes in the gravel parking lot? And can you fix the wireless access on campus? So I felt like a small town mayor at that point.
Yeah, it probably was the reverse priority. It's like, fix the Wi-Fi, please.
Oh my goodness, yeah. In fact, it's funny. I think our Wi-Fi speed today is something like, I don't know, maybe 10x of what it was 8 years ago, and it's still not enough. But of course, they're streaming more movies than they ever did 7 years ago.
Yeah. And video games, high definition video games.
You know, I don't know if to be a fan of Fortnite or not, but I'll tell you, it's definitely causing a bandwidth issue here at Jessup.
That's great. Hey, scratch that from the record. We don't want that quoted anywhere.
Yeah, I know. Especially not during midterms and finals week.
Yeah, right. You can block that with there's got to be somebody in the IT department.
Oh, there is. They're smart people. They know how to do it.
There you go. Have you ever engaged with the students in that way directly on many of these topics?
Well, the great thing is I do have a 20-year-old son who's actually a student at Jessup, and so he tried to get me exposed to Fortnite one time, and I was able to watch it for a few minutes and said, "Nah, not for me." But anyway, it is very common for me to be on campus. I'm not on campus all the time, but when I am on campus, I enjoy spending time with the students, and they'll often share what's top of their mind. And quite frankly, it's not bandwidth anymore. It is topics like parking spaces and classroom capacity. And one of the great things we have here at Jessup and what sets us apart is faculty who love to sew into the life of their students. And so that's just really a great joy to know that they love their professors and their professors invest in them.
That's so important. I'll never forget, I had a physics teacher back in high school. After a lackluster first year and freshman year, with basic science, a biology class in second year that was just okay. I got like a B, and then a terrible year in chemistry where I was not interested at all. My senior year, I had a physics teacher who was so excited to teach physics that he would talk to us about his life. He would talk about physics. He went to one of the premier colleges in the nation for sciences. And I loved it. I got an A+ in that class, or
Wow.
some A+. It was so much fun because the teacher was willing to engage with us on a personal level that was phenomenal.
Well, that's a great life shaping experience. And when I talk to people about, why Jessup or why come to a college like this, one of the things I often will say is that in the course of your college career, if we do a great job, one or two professors will actually imprint on your life for the rest of your life. And at Jessup, for instance, within a week of attending here, somebody with a PhD or terminal degree in their field will know you by name. And that's really an amazing contribution to the shaping of a young person's life.
That's cool. How do is there a unique structure there at Jessup where you guys encourage that more personal interaction with your professors?
Yeah, when I first got here, I think one of the things that we would talk about in terms of competitive advantage is, well, we're small. but I didn't feel like being small was necessarily good enough. In fact, a stat from when I first got here is that between our sophomore and junior year, we only had about a 60% retention rate because we didn't have enough degrees. So people would get to their sophomore year, figure out what they wanted to do, and say, I can't complete it at Jessup. Well, now we have about an 85% retention rate because we've added so many degrees. I think we've added about 30 degrees the last several years. Wow. So it's not that we're small, it's that we're very intentionally focused. All of our professors, the full-time professors here, we have about 70 full-time professors, about 250 adjuncts. Every single one of our professors here are committed to teaching not only at the undergraduate level, but the graduate level as well. And I think you get to the larger universities and, your great professors tend to migrate to the graduate level courses. I got my doctorate from a UC, amazing educational experience. But if you're at a UC as an undergrad, you're probably not getting access to a full professor and certainly not getting access in your freshman and sophomore year. And at Jessup, we have full professors who teach in the freshman, sophomore, junior classes at the undergraduate level. And if you're in the sciences, by the way, since you mentioned sciences, it's not uncommon for a Jessup student to do research with their professor as an undergrad. And we've even had a few who've been published with their professors. That's an amazing journey. And I'm pretty committed, even though we're growing a lot, to make sure that we keep that distinctive here.
Yeah, it's interesting what you say too about the fact that in the younger years, they're being taught by the actual professors instead of a student filling in. And also size of class. I remember when I went to Berkeley, in 75.
That was 1975, Dave?
1975,
okay,
yes. Actually, it was 1875. Actually, I went in 74. No, I started in 75. Yeah, 75. And, there were 300 people or more, in a class. So you don't get to know the professors. You don't have that bonding, right, that mentoring that can occur in an environment like Jessup, which I think is crucial.
And I think that's a two-way street. I had similar experiences as you're describing, but I also had wonderful experiences in my undergraduate going to a smaller school and getting that, 10 to 1, 15 to 1 kind of class where you're getting real personal. I think mentoring goes both ways. The benefit for the student, of course, is to have access to the full professor, but there's a flip side to that. When professors are doing mentoring like this at the undergrad level, they're really sowing seeds that are going to have generational impact. And I think our professors, if you teach at Jessup, you have to love that. If you don't love that, by the way, you probably don't want to be here at Jessup, because that's part of the maybe core operating principle of this school.
And I think, just translating over everything you're saying, we're talking about Jessup, but everything you're saying applies with leadership.
Oh, I couldn't be more supportive of that notion. And John Maxwell, a great leadership writer, says everything rises and falls on leadership. And I agree with that, but I want to have a John Jackson corollary to that. I love John Maxwell, but I want to have a corollary. Everything not only rises and falls on leadership, but everything in leadership rises and falls on relationship. And in a business context, the ability to pour into your team to make sure that you care about them. If I could, let me give you a quick little story. A young man at Jessup who's worked with us for about 4 years, been a great guy, wonderful stuff. He just announced this week that he's leaving for another employment opportunity. And I was excited for him. It's a great opportunity. We didn't have the particular upward path here at Jessup that he wanted. And so I happen to know the employer he's going to. He's going to get a significant raise in responsibilities and compensation. His career path will be glorious. And so I've celebrated that for him and with him. And he came to me and said, it just really mattered to me that you were for me, that you didn't sort of keep me where I was. You wanted me to go to a next great opportunity. And I think that's part of what, supervisors or leaders often worry. If I, equip somebody and train them, that I'm going to lose them. And I just think at the end of the day, if you pour yourself into leadership equipping, you're always going to have a ready supply of people who are going to want to achieve greatness, because everybody wants greatness in their lives. So I think it's all about relationship and pouring into your people.
Yeah. And then, instead of a guilt trip, and then it also works out, I would assume, John, I don't know whether you have another story, but where, you greet that person, you wish them the best. And, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years passes, and all of a sudden your paths cross again, and there's an opportunity to do something together again that's mutually beneficial.
Well, and don't we all know that it used to be 6 degrees of separation, but that's not true anymore. We're down to probably 2 or 3 at the most degrees of separation. Everybody knows somebody through somebody, and so you're absolutely right, David. We get people come back to Jessup after being gone 3 to 5 years, or in my life, people I've known 20, 30 years ago are still in my orbit. We may not live in the same town, but we still have connection through the internet or through other social networks, and sometimes we get to work together again.
Yeah, cool. And John, you have an orbit that spans not just the educational sphere, but you've been on a fortuitous journey for a while up until your job here at William Jessup. You were previously a pastor, correct?
Yeah, I've kind of had an interesting journey. I was a youth pastor, associate pastor, senior pastor. At age 31, then I became a denominational executive, oversaw 270 churches, 4 Western states. By virtue of that role, sat on 9 corporate boards. It was kind of an interesting journey. But for me, that eventuated into starting a church. So I often tell entrepreneurs, I speak a lot in entrepreneurial settings and leadership settings. Starting a church for me was the equivalent of a startup business. I had to get, if you won't mind the reference, I had to get a minimally viable product. I had to prove the market, and then I had to scale. And if you're an entrepreneur, you've been down that road, and you've had product failures, and you've had marketing failures, and you've had scaling failures. And I also have the advantage, Jeff, of having a brother who has had 11 businesses, meteoric successes and horrifying failures. So I have a particular fondness for entrepreneurship. So that's one of the things I think I bring into this college presidency role. I never spent a day in higher ed administration prior to becoming president. I knew leadership. I knew what it meant to teach, to communicate, to cast vision. But boy, academic structures and all the acronyms and the all that was just something that was unfamiliar with. But in this role, I've tried to bring a very strong entrepreneurial orientation, because you probably both know this. Universities are not known for innovation. Universities are known for, we started in the 1300s. This is the way we've always done it, and by golly, we're going to keep doing it that way. But it's exciting, and we're in a good season here at Jessup, and in many schools across the country are experiencing some good things.
So I'm curious, John, about what you just said. Not your experience as much as, can you speak to anything? Why did they choose you, and what were you doing at that time? Because you talk about colleges not kind of being innovative or doing something out of the box. Maybe that's definitely what they did in getting you engaged. What led them to make that decision?
Yeah,
I think a lot of people get stuck, thinking, can't do that. That's not the way we do things, or so-and-so won't like it. My board won't like it. My team won't like it, whatever. Apparently you had somebody who was thinking differently, or a group that was thinking differently. I'm kind of curious about that.
Yeah, I think the board of William Jessup University was very bold and creative. I want to pay tribute to my predecessor, Bryce Jessup, who stayed for 26 years, got the school from San Jose to here, did some really groundbreaking things. But then I also want to honor him that he said, my time has come and gone. I need to be able to step aside. And not only did he step aside, he had left a board that had some really solid people. He calls them his dream team, probably 6 or 8 guys from the Bay Area. They were tech executives. And so I have a deep appreciation for the tech world. Pat Gelsinger is a name I'll mention. Pat's the CEO of VMware. At the time, he was the president of EMC, a very large data storage corporation. He was the first chief technology officer for Intel. So really a great guy. He was chairing the board. And Pat's really the guy who challenged me once they found me, and I'll tell you about that in a moment, to consider what it would mean to lead an organization like this. So I had pastored a church. I'd worked with a denomination. But most recently, prior to coming to Jessup, I was a part of Bayside Church, a very large multi-site church in the region here in Sacramento. But beyond that, I had launched a national organization called Thriving Churches International to work with churches. So I think the group here knew that I had a strong relationship with churches. I had a good connection to the geography of the Northern California area. I had strong roots in Southern California, and I think they were willing to take a risk on me, and I was willing to take a risk that I could take what had up to that point been kind of a family operation and move it to really becoming a legitimate regional university. And thankfully, that's what's happened over these last 7 or 8 years.
Interesting.
And have you found that anybody from your previous circles has joined you on your journey?
Interestingly enough, on my executive team, we have about 7 of us on the executive team. So there's 6 plus me. And of those 6, 3 of those come from a higher ed background, and the other 3 come from outside of higher ed. And that's been an important mixture for me to maintain. These are not people that I worked with in previous life, but they worked in ministries or industries that I had relationship with. So I had confidence in their background, I had confidence in their capabilities. It's mixing higher ed with maybe some of the more nonprofit or corporate settings has been an important component for me. There's a guy named Clayton Christensen who's written a lot about innovation theory and disruptive innovation. And he's turned his sights on higher ed and said that higher ed is in a disruptive season. So if you've ever been in the steel industry or the automotive industry or the knowledge industry, you have to be ready to respond to disruptive forces in the marketplace. And so a specific question is, I have a couple people that I've known through the years in church life who are working here at Jessup, but on my senior team, there's a good mixture of people from the marketplace, general marketplace, and people from the higher ed world. And I think that mixture has been healthy for our leadership team.
Speaking of disruption in the educational space, I've heard a lot of talk about, for instance, I love listening to Mike Rowe's podcast. Mm-hmm. He has a short podcast. It's short stories, and he often plugs his organization, Micro Works, where they talk about giving the kind of scholarships offered in today's typical colleges and universities to people who want to pursue disciplines in forget the term, but manual labor is the
term. Right.
And how do you see that landscape? Being at the top of a university, how do you see the landscape of education? And do you think this big push for college for everyone is right, or do you think that maybe micro and some of these guys are talking about vocational degrees? How does that affect you, and how do you see the landscape around?
Well, I'm a bit of an odd duck to be a college president, so fasten your seatbelt. Number one, I'm a total micro fan, and I think if you want a job and you want to make a really good income across America, if you're a plumber, if you're an electrician, if you're a welder, if you're a finished carpenter, you will never be out of work. So this sort of notion that you have to have a 4-year college degree in order to get a job and provide for your family and have a reasonable and fulfilling life is just craziness. So that's on the one hand. Okay. On the second hand, we do have a workforce that's really radically changing. So many of the jobs in the American economy are increasingly requiring some level of training beyond high school. Yeah. Now, I'm a super big fan of, if you're not going to get a 4-year college degree, then get something in your hand. So if you're going to be that carpenter, for instance, you got to go through the pathway of becoming a carpenter, but I'd also encourage you to take some project management skills or courses, get some certifications, because you're not always going to be wanting to swing that 16-penny hammer. You're gonna want to ultimately to know how to run a business. You're going to want to know how to become a project manager and sort of get off the swinging the hammer a bit. There is a point where your body just says, "Hey, I just can't do that when I'm in my 50s and beyond." So I really think that a lot of jobs are going to require additional education. It's not always a 4-year degree. And so what I've been a super huge fan of is this. At our school, we talk about one of our 3 primary objectives is for people to be exceptionally employable. So this is what I'd say to Mike Rowe. What I love about Mike Rowe's focus is that he gets people in the real world. They get mentored or apprenticed, they get real world experience, and they get a job. And that's awesome. I want to equip people for not just their first job, but for their 40 to 50 years, 40 to 50 years of work life. People are not retiring at 60, 62, 65 anymore. And most recent research I've seen says you're going to have 5 or 6 careers, not jobs, careers in your work life. You're going to literally shift 10 degrees, 20 degrees as the economy shifts, and you're going to need to get transferable skills, be a lifelong learner. So I'm very pro having a bachelor's degree, yes. But if you just get that piece of paper and you have no real world experience, you're not exceptionally employable. So at our school, for instance, at Jessup, we say you can get a bachelor's degree, But by the time you walk across our stage to get that diploma, you better have some real world experience in an internship. You better have been mentored in a workplace. So you don't just have an accounting degree or a teaching degree or a business degree. You actually have real world experience on your resume. And that's where Mike Rowe and I think would have a great time together. I don't know if he's a coffee drinker, but I'd love to have a cup of coffee with him. We could talk about these subjects.
We'll send him a note for you. Let him know.
There you go. Thanks.
Yeah.
Hook me up. Hook me up with him.
Yeah.
That'd be great. I love that. I think that's really important. You know, when I was in college, I heard a lot of talk about internships and real world experience, but there was just kind of it was a fluttering. It was not serious. It was not sitting down with a counselor and saying, hey, you know, this is exactly what you need to do, and here are the steps you need to take. And at Jessup, I think we're at 85% now. 85% of our degrees require you to have specific workplace experience before we'll give you the piece of paper. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
That's what I would have needed as a kick in the butt to really get going.
Yeah.
Because I didn't have an internship until maybe my junior or between my junior and senior year.
Sure.
So, I mean, and then once I did, which was through a marketing professor who was a big fan of, you know, guys on the soccer team. I played on the soccer team at USF. He would hire, guys for internships almost every summer that were on the
That's
soccer
great.
team. Yeah, it was great. And he ran a small digital marketing firm in San Francisco, and he was connected to pretty much everyone in that space. He was very well known, very, great guy, very friendly, talkative, and he would bring us under his wing and really help us out. And that really gave me an avenue. That was how I got a job about a few years later.
Wow.
Yeah. Somebody through LinkedIn, they said, hey, I know this guy. And then he's connected to this guy. And they brought me in and said, oh yeah, you're good. We know who you are. You have a good reputation from John.
That's awesome. That's good. Love it.
So crucial.
But you know, I love that. That would have kept me in school. I've said that for years now. I didn't realize I went to Berkeley, quit relatively quickly. And it took me till I was 28 years old to realize that if I had been doing something where I also had some type of internship,
yes,
I would have stayed.
Right.
And I really regretted the decision. It was too late by then.
So I'm going to seem like a troublemaker, and I don't mean to be. And I have dear, dear, dear friends. I have a PhD and lots of friends who have doctorates, but I think there's a vested interest in the academy to keep the gap between theory and practice feeling like a Grand Canyon. And I think it shouldn't be a Grand Canyon. It should be a step off a curb. I have friends who are attorneys who tell me they finished law school. It takes them a year or two to figure out what being a lawyer means. So even though they've spent summers, being an assistant or that sort of thing in a law firm, there's still, when you get in the real world where you're working full time, it absolutely is a bit of an adjustment. I just wish the gap between theory and practice in most university or higher ed settings was not a Grand Canyon gap. And quite frankly, I think that academics sometimes want it to be a Grand Canyon gap. And that's why I love, for instance, our School of Business, our School of Education here at Jessup, psychology department. These folks are real world connected. You're not taking a marketing class from somebody who didn't do marketing for the last decade, because if you're 10 years out of date in marketing, you're about 3 centuries out of date.
Yeah, and your lawyer, I mean, that's if they go in, that's if they even decide they want to be a lawyer.
Yeah, that's right.
A lot of times. So,
John, why do you think that gap exists? And why do you think it's so large? Why is it a Grand Canyon and not a curb?
Well, I think quite frankly, it's just a matter of values. Sometimes the academy has so valued theory. And I have to sort of admit on the front end, I'm an applied knowledge kind of guy. So I appreciate theory, but I always want to know what difference it makes. And the academy sometimes so values theoretical constructs and theoretical frameworks, which causes a little bit of automatic drift. In the academy at our worst, and the academy has some awesome things about it, but in the academy at our worst, we sort of think of applied knowledge as too pedestrian, too dirty. I've actually had academics say to me, we don't do training here, we do education. Well, I think a little bit of that is artificial. You know what? Because at the end of the day, if I do education and it never has the ability to translate itself into application, then I'm kind of questioning the ultimate value of it. So I think some values in the academy are like that. And then I think just the pace of change. The real world of marketing, for instance, the real world of finance, the real world of manufacturing, of supply chain management, all those things change rapidly. This podcast is part of your way of connecting your audience to real world conversations that are changing weekly. The nature of the academy is long, deep, serious reflection over years, maybe sometimes decades or centuries, which again is all awesome. I'm for it. I just want to see the translation. So I think it's sort of a values conflict.
I really love what you're saying. And the reason I was looking down a moment ago was I wanted to write down that you want every student to be exceptionally employable.
Yes.
I thought that was a great pair of words there. I didn't want to forget them.
Yeah.
I mean, the country would be a totally different country if the majority of our universities, colleges were taking that approach versus being ranked 27th in the world. I mean,
Yes.
it'd be a totally different nation.
So let me give you two others that I say. We're a faith-based school, so I say thriving spiritually. Want your faith to be built up, not torn down. The second thing is, and some of your tech listeners will maybe be challenged here, but I think they'll agree with me at the end. So thrive spiritually. The second thing is quality liberal arts education. And the way I describe that is when you graduate, you should be able to read, write, think, and speak well. Read, write, think, and speak well. And if not, you should get a refund.
And not only that, but I don't know how much you emphasize it. I was just in an event last week by Hillsdale College.
Yeah.
And
great school.
Where you're teaching the students how to, not what to think, but how to think. How do you discern what's factual, what's not factual, what's logical, what's not logical? You know, that whole type of thing. I think that's a real challenge for a lot of people of all ages.
And for my friends in the tech world, where again, it's changing, maybe daily, but at least change on a rapid and regular basis. If you can't think well, if you don't know how to think, if you can't read quickly, if you can't write and speak, you're going to have a hard time staying up with your field of study. And so again, some statistics, one that's frightening to me is that 30% of all the jobs that will exist 15 years from now exist today. Well, if that's the case, and if 70% of the jobs that are around 15 to 20 years from now don't exist right now, how do I train you for that? Well, I can't. I just need to equip you to know how to think and how to learn so that as your field changes and morphs, you're going to end up being able to navigate that. That's just a super important thing for the workforce, is to know how to be exceptionally employable and keep exceptionally employable in the days and years ahead.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too how these 2 points, two of the points you made, one thing of having the internship and how these two things relate to our Hire the Best system, this system I've developed over the past 12, 15 years.
Great.
I recommend you don't hire anybody without a test drive. So you see whether they can do work competently and whether they fit with the culture. And that's really what an internship is. It's on the front end. And the second thing, you bring up writing. I have a growing number of clients that now, as part of the interview process, an early part, they will have the person come in their first interview, and often before they even meet with anybody, they'll say, "Hey, will you write 2 or 3 paragraphs about anything you want? I just want to see how you write."
Yes,
and so they don't want it done separately where they're getting advice and they're going through revisions and everything like that. They want to make certain this person's writing it. But they'll have that part of the first interview because writing is so big responsibility in every role that someone's in. And if all you do is know how to text and acronyms, it's not going to make it.
So true. You're singing a good song. And we probably at Jessup need to incorporate that in our hiring processes, have a writing sample that's done that moment. We ask for writing beforehand, but that's a good practice. I enjoy it.
When you ask for it beforehand, there's going to be a percentage, probably a small percentage, that are going to get somebody else to write it for them.
Sure.
Or totally change what they've written. So it's really not their skill.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
Dad, I haven't heard that before. I didn't know that people were doing that. That's so important today, especially, John, you can probably speak to this with newer generations that are so engrossed in technology. I meet some people today, some younger people, some even older people that are so terrible with communication. And I've noticed actually with the older people, there's a friend of mine is I think just turned 50. He's a surfing buddy of mine. And I know that he does not want to receive a lot of texts from me. He doesn't want to get into a text message conversation. He wants to engage with me in a more personal way. So I give him a call. To talk on the phone about something if I have something in depth to talk about. and it's so much better. On the flip side, I could communicate with someone who's younger. I have another younger surfer buddy who's 23, 24, and just the difference in communication is so big. It's he'll send me a whole flurry of text messages, and other younger people will send me text messages that don't make sense unless you like you would need a translator sometimes to try and figure out what the heck they're trying to say.
That'll be another Google product eventually, is how to translate text message acronyms
from different generations.
Yes, right. Yeah, I do think it's a challenge, and we can diss, if I could use that phrase, diss on the younger generation for all the acronyms and their texting. But I think the reality is even all the social media platforms lend themselves to communicating, as it were, in shorthand. And also, by the way, in our social media platforms, we tend to aggregate around ourselves people who agree with us. So pretty soon it's sort of a return to a form of tribalism, I think, where we end up communicating with people who think like us, who agree with us. We sort of block people who don't, and therefore the language we get accustomed to using is understandable to our digital tribe. I have a daughter who leads a leadership school in a large church, Bayside Church, and she and her husband do that. And they tell me all the time, Dad, they say it's not the parents, it's not the pastors or the teachers that are shaping the students. It's their 4 or 5 social media platforms that are informing their worldview and how they communicate, including, by the way, the acronyms that they use.
Yeah, no social media for my kid. I don't know.
There you go. Break that phone as early as you can.
Yeah. So you've worked a lot with millennials and the younger generations. What's one of the biggest issues you find that, say that you try to get them to adopt in their life, different practices, different life values, or maybe just different opinions that they have on things that you found is kind of a struggle?
Yeah. So when you think about employers, one of the knocks on millennials is they want to know by week 3 why they're not the vice president. And there's sort of the expectation that they'll move quickly, rapidly, salary and position and that sort of thing. A couple things I've found positively about millennials is that they're not only very cause related, so they have a very passionate social justice and cause orientation, but I think millennials also have a deep commitment that words are not enough. They are very activator oriented. They want to make sure, if mosquito nets are the deal, they're not just going to give money for mosquito nets or make a tweet. They want to know how they can be involved in the delivery or the construction of those mosquito nets. If safe water is the issue, if homelessness is the issue, they want to go after it. So I think tying their jobs, if you're an employer, tying their jobs to specific causes, demonstrating for them the effects or the outputs of what they're doing. And then for millennials, I spend a lot of time talking to millennials about the reward of disciplined habits over time. I think so much of our current society expects to see transformation and world change and impact, but I want it in a week. And that's just not the way life is built. That's not the way relationships are built. I mean, I'm sure both of you could say this. The richest relationships in your lives are, decades long. They're family, they're friends, they're people you've ridden the roller coaster of life with, the ups and the downs. That's what builds rich, meaningful texture. And so I know we don't think we're going to go to work for a company and be there 20 years, 30 years, 40 years these days, but I would say your life impact will be a series of the application of meaningful and responsible habits into the context in which you serve. So I tell people all the time at Jessup, if you're here for 2 years or you're here for 20, there's some disciplines and some habits that you want to develop here that will serve you well here or wherever else you go. And if you're here 2 years, we want to know that you made a meaningful contribution, and the way you'll do that is to bring your best in a consistent fashion with these really rich and rewarding habits.
Is every student that you have at William Jessup, I know it's a primarily Christian school. Do you have primarily Christian students?
Great question. It's probably a little unfair, but I kind of look at our student body and I would think of them in thirds. 1/3 of the students are, yes, deeply committed in their faith as Christians. Another 1/3 are what I would describe as maybe cultural. They grew up in a Christian home or Christian school, and so they kind of have a cultural understanding, but it's not real deeply personal for them. And then people are surprised. I think as many as 1/3 of our students are pretty clear that they don't have a faith commitment, that they're not currently people who would express a Christian faith or commitment. They're open maybe to exploring. They want the environment that we provide. It feels safe here. It feels like a warm place to pursue your life direction, but they would not be people of faith. So it's probably a little unfair, but 1/3 is the way I think about it.
I think that's great.
Yeah, it really does provide a great ecosystem. Our professors, takes a while to get used to it, but our professors realize when they're speaking in a class, whether it's a Bible class or an ethics or history or business or English class, that there's different folks in the audience. And by the way, that's every day. That's the workplace. That's your neighborhood. That's your gym. Why not get used to it now?
Yeah, that leads into my next step. I was going to ask you, you made a comment on previous podcast about the insular nature of the church and how people often stay stuck in their own church communities and don't branch out. I think, just as David said, it's a great example of William Jessup. It speaks to the culture of William Jessup that people who are not Christians or consider themselves religious attend, a school that labels itself as a Christian university.
Yeah. So a couple thoughts here, and don't let me go for too long. So just point to me, and I'll be quiet because I've got a deep well here. Back in the 400 ADs, a guy named Augustine wrote a book called The City of God, and he was talking about what it meant to be, heavenly minded and experience that here on earth. A lot of wonderful things. I think sometimes people of faith have believed that in order to not get stained, if I could use that word, stained by the world around us, politics is messy, entertainment is messy, business is messy, science is messy, that we've kind of withdrawn from society. And I've got to tell you, I have this deep and abiding conviction that is exactly opposite from what people of faith need to do. I want us to be engaged in the public square. I think that unfortunately, sometimes people of faith have bought the lie that there's such a thing as a sacred and secular divide. And I just believe that's a terribly, terribly wrong-headed way of thinking about things. I think if you're a person of faith, all of life is sacred. So when you're in the business community, you got a chance to live it out. When you're in government, when you're in education, when you're in any one of those spheres of cultural activity, you be a person of faith. But by the way, as a person of faith, you should be an amazing business leader. You should be an amazing politician. You should be an amazing educator. Pat Gelsinger, whose name I mentioned before, he and I sometimes tease with each other. I think his company now has 18,000 employees, and he says that he's a pastor of an 18,000 member church. And in some ways he's right. Every single day people are watching him, and which is kind of scary in some ways, but in other ways he's going to live out his faith. He's pretty open about it. He's going to live out his faith and do that engaged in the public square. I really think that's what we need to do. Engage in the public square, be a person of faith, and let your light shine.
Well, I think you talk about amazing. I think amazing is great. But I also think that the simple word of safe that you used before is even more important. Jeff, do we need to clip this because I got the dog barking? I mean,
no, it's fine. I've always wanted to have Max on the podcast. So.
That's right. This podcast is going to the dogs, I tell
you. Somebody just rang the doorbell. I'm not going to answer it.
But it's nice to hear him barking. Go ahead. Just continue.
Anyway, but this concept where, you create a safe environment where anybody of any beliefs, as long as they're willing to be civil about it,
yes,
are welcome. And I think that's an awesome thing.
That's so good, David. I just want to quickly hit that word. You said the word civil. That's been so important to me. People would be surprised to know this, but folks have various views of human sexuality. That's a hot topic in our day. I have many long-term friendships and pretty consistent public connection and relationship with folks who have very different views on human sexuality than I do. But we have got to learn how to be civil with one another and civil. So recently, for instance, I've been helping to coordinate a group. It has folks from 3 different faith traditions being able to talk about what does it mean to be civil as people of faith in the public square with a civil voice. And I just think that's so important for all Americans, for all people to learn how to be civil, redemptive, loving, not in spite of our differences, but because of our differences. Civility is absolutely key.
And very missing today.
Oh, boy. Yeah, I guess I grew up in a family where we aren't Greek, but I think of that movie, My Big Fat Greek Wedding. Our family's kind of like that, loud and obnoxious and, enmeshed and all that. So it's 40, 50 people. And
Hoppa!
Hoppa! Always pretty politically engaged. So our family gets loud and people disagree with each other, but in the safety of the family, you can disagree, and doesn't matter if you're an R, a D, or an I, or just fed up and disgusted, and you're none of those letters politically. We got to learn how to disagree and still be civil and respectful.
I want to talk about this more, but really quick, I wanted to go back to the topic we covered previously about kind of church people, being insular is the word that I used.
Yeah.
Why do you think that people in the church, how do you think that developed?
I think that what happened, if I just do this century, and I know it's happened at different times, in about the 1920s, we had a big, huge issue called modernity, post-industrial revolution. We were starting to see more and more sophistication in society, and the moral compass of society began to drift pretty substantially. So in reaction to modernity, in reaction to the roaring 20s, a lot of Christian people began to be disconnected. And I'll just give you a couple examples. Oh my goodness. Christian people of faith can't be involved in the media, film and entertainment. That's where bad stuff happens. We said the same thing about politics. We said the same thing about education. So we kind of set up a series of alternative universes, parallel ones, by the way. We have Christian films, Christian education. Of course, here I am leading a faith-based university. But by the way, my faith-based university is very involved in the economic, political, educational, and business structure of our community. We do that on purpose because we don't want to set up a parallel opposite universe. But I think that's what happened, Jeff, is that in the 1920s, we reacted to modernity. We began to pull further and further away from society, and people kind of got the idea that if I'm a person of faith, I can't be stained by engagement in the public square. And I think that's exactly opposite. Yeah. If you go to church on a weekend, hopefully you have a great experience. And when you go to work on Monday, whether that's entertainment or business or government or education, you're actually still a person of faith in that marketplace. And that's sacred space. That's not secular. So I think that's how it evolved, at least here in the U.S.
Yeah, I felt very strongly the same way as I've watched certain people put their kids in private school or put their kids in a private church school. And I've commented in as civil as I can be in conversations that perhaps instead of spending the certain amount of money that is being spent on private school, why not engage more with the public school? Why not, and I'm not talking about universities, just regular elementary schools or high schools. It does seem that people who are spiritual or religious or of a certain notion tend to, it is the tribalism that you mentioned before. And it's frustrating to me in the past, 10 years that I've realized, like, wait a minute, if you have a positive contribution to make to society, pulling yourself away from the rest of society isn't going to make society better. It may make your life better in some regards. It may make it simpler, certainly, but it's not going to be a long-term positive effect on.
Well, let me affirm something and also give some, affirmations and some freedoms. I think every family has to decide what they want to do. So if you are in public school or private school, homeschool, or any variation thereof, my question for you is, what's your ultimate aim? And your ultimate aim ought to be influence and impact and transformation in society. Now, you might say as a parent, well, gosh, I want my child to be protected from grades X to X. Well, okay, so if that's the case, I affirm that and honor that for your role as a parent. But I also want to know, are you disconnecting your child from influence with other children? And so my biggest concern is if you are private school or homeschool, are you disconnecting from society? Our ultimate goal as people of faith is to be impactful, is to be redemptive in society. So don't withdraw from society. Your ultimate goal is to influence and to connect. So if you go to the gym and you lift weights, the goal of lifting weights is to build up muscle. To what end? If you're going to go to homeschool, private school, public school, to what end? I would hope that the answer for any person of faith is for a redemptive end. I want people to know God loves them, God cares for them, and we want to be a positive influence in society.
Yeah, and I think, Jeff will attest that I haven't done this the best in my parenting, as he and his brother and sister, and then we've adopted 5 kids.
Nobody's perfect.
But I have said for many years, when people have posed that question to me, do I go private? Do I go homeschool? Do I go public? I've said, I've found that the difference is how involved you are in the school. It's not the setting. It's how involved you are. And then if you go homeschool, and I think you're alluding to it by saying removing from society, if you're going to go homeschool, then okay, what activities are you going to put your kids in where they're interacting with other kids?
Completely agree. And it is, if you think about this, I'll give you a Bible passage if you want. Deuteronomy 6, the parents are the first teachers and the most important teachers. So if you're in a public school, private school, homeschool, essentially it's what is your family doing to engage? I love the way you said that, David. It's your level of engagement. Are you as the responsible adult engaged in your kids' lives? That's the key.
Yeah.
It's good.
Well, let's talk about civility now.
Should we start interrupting each other to make a point?
We should.
There we go.
Good job.
But I think that's actually maybe a good place to start. Part of civility is the discipline to not be formulating your answer while the other person is talking, and to not interrupt them. It's part of civility is to listen. And I find that very challenging, to be honest. I'd rather talk. So I think, civility is a series of disciplines, one of which is to respect the people. A second one is, by respecting them, to demonstrate that by listening to them. And I think we have a culture that doesn't listen.
Oh, I agree. And, there was a recent, I forget what the issue was, forgive me, whether it was gun control or whatever, but there was an issue recently in the past few months, wasn't there, where high schoolers or college age kids walked out one day of school in protest of something. And in some cases, were even encouraged by school administrators to do so. And I was so disappointed because I think it's great that they were cause oriented, but they seem to lack the listening part and the questioning part. What questions can we ask about this situation? We're upset about it. What can we discuss that are potential solutions? How can we impact this? And instead went to, what could be perceived as more of like a victim mentality, whiner type of thing of, oh, we're just going to, take off at school and say all the adults are bad people. It was such a great opportunity to say, hey, how do we think about this? How do we dialogue about it? How do we work through this? And as you say, it's not going to be solved in a day. What an opportunity.
That's good. And I think maybe another adjunct here is that I've mentioned tribalism before. If you're old enough, you remember Balkanization. What happened was a nation ended up, the Balkans actually ended up fragmenting into ever smaller pieces. And I worry, quite frankly, native-born U.S. person, I worry that the United States is subject to a form of balkanization because we've so gotten to the point where we polarize and demonize, and the easiest thing to do is to put a label on somebody. Oh, you're conservative, you're liberal, you're this, that, the other thing. And every once in a while, I will enjoy, if I don't have my president's hat on, being in a social setting to say, hey, I'm this label. For instance, for me, I would say I'm conservative, generally speaking, but here's 3 areas where I have what might be considered actually more moderate or liberal positions on this issue or that issue. And boy, you want to stir up a hornet's nest, it's to defy your label. Oh, I've always thought of you as X. Well, okay, but I actually am a thinking person. I can grapple with these issues, and the label is not what defines me. So I think that being willing to listen, being willing to learn, and not if you have enough respect for people so that you don't just have a label, I'm more than the color of my skin, I'm more than the political label, I'm more than my income level or my address. We've tended to have such a fixation in the US with once I put a label on you, then I have you completely figured out. I think that's very dangerous.
Yeah, that seems to be in large part due to the simplistic nature of the media we receive today. I think that's why I don't watch a lot of news. News to me is now sports scores and natural disasters. That's what I tune in for. Anything else, it just seems like garbage.
Yeah, and you were talking earlier when we were off air about reading some historical material, and you think about people when communication was more challenging had to write letters, and letters were often complicated. Public speeches were often long and challenging, and it's easy for us to go, oh, people in 1840 must have been really ignorant. Well, if you read the literature of that time, they actually were engaged in some pretty profound conversations, and you had to process a lot of detail. And it's true, they didn't get exposed to the torrent of information that we get every day, but because of that, I think we're maybe a little poor for it, because all of our information, as you said, comes in bite-sized, pre-processed. I was listening, to be honest, to the news this morning, and I turned to my wife and I said, I just want you to be clear, this is not news. This is all opinion. It's fine, but it's not news. It's opinion. And we need to make sure when we're listening to this, we know it's not news. This is not factual, classical journalism. This is nothing but op-ed masquerading as news. But then I stopped my rant.
Had to get it in.
I had to get it in. Boy, I had to. And she just nodded her head like the sweet woman that she is.
Oh, there he goes again.
Yeah.
Yeah, the book, the thing we were talking about was Team of Rivals. I'm in the middle of it. Well, I'm closer to the end now by Doris Kearns Goodwin. And yeah, it's fascinating because I would say you're exactly right. The people that I'm reading about and the higher echelons of society who had time to write letters were incredibly they were civil, first of all, because they were writing something with their own signature on it. They couldn't just dismiss it or delete it. They couldn't delete their tweet later.
Yeah.
And so anybody who could bring that to a newspaper man and they could reprint it and say, well, we have the evidence that you've said this. Everything's on record.
Yes. If anybody wants to just Google this, look at Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, both signers in 1776, both presidents of the United States. Interestingly enough, they both died on July 4th, 1826. And I forget who died first. I think Jefferson actually died first, and then a couple hours later, Adams did. But if you look at their correspondence, they were, to use a modern word, rasty nasty, meaning they had massive disagreements. Massive. But the civility that their 50-year disagreement, it's pretty intense on occasion, but boy, I love the fact that they kept talking with each other and they kept writing and they kept contending because they had different visions of where the country was going. And I honor that. They did not hold lightly to their opinions. They held it strong, but they kept writing. Today, we just click onto another channel or, block somebody from social media or say, I don't want to hear from you anymore. And it's kind of problematic if it's in your family, but we have a way to do that. And I think that's not civil. Civility is respecting other people, even when, and especially when you disagree.
Yeah. And it seems like there were some instances, or at least many instances of being uncivil back then, but the value was placed on civility. There was a value placed on honor and being kind to one another and, respecting someone.
That's so good, Jeff. I think that's so, like, we sometimes think civil means I can't have strong opinions. And I guess that's what I want to contend against. You can be civil, think somebody's wrong and dead wrong, terribly wrong, horribly wrong, but you can still honor and respect them as a human being and still honor value that they have as a fellow citizen. This will be deep waters, and I don't mean to muddy them too much, but it bothers me when people of faith say, I can pray for the last president, I can't pray for this one. or I could pray for this president and I couldn't pray for the last one. That's a problem. That's a serious problem. If you can't honor people in positions of authority, even when you terribly disagree with them. By the way, you could disagree vehemently against their policies, but there still has to be a way to honor the individual and the office.
Oh, trust me, it hits home. I'm down in the Santa Monica area in SoCal, and I've gone, hung out with different people, gone on dates, and I want to be very open to being able to discuss things and issues.
Yes.
In a broad light, with forgiveness for, some of the more absurd things that people say, and try to understand exactly what's going on. And it's just there's no ability to.
Yeah. And I think that's maybe a challenge for our society. And by the way, it's a challenge in the workplace. I think a lot of your listeners are business folks. And so you think about in the marketplace, when you're in the lunchroom, when you're at the break room and having conversations, or you're on the line, or you're in a project meeting or a team meeting, and people get to talking about something, and boy, the opinions can be flashpoints. I think part of what organizations of the future are going to have to do is some remedial training to educate people how to express opinions in ways that do not diminish other human beings and can be accepting. We talk about diversity all the time. Thought diversity actually is apparently a lost skill in much of the country. We've got to be able to recognize that people have different opinions, and it's okay. And we can contend for them strongly and be civil.
But one of the challenges too, with all the dialogue of diversity, at times today, if not too often, crosses the line from equal opportunity to equal entitlement. That everybody's entitled to the same thing, or someone who's driving the diversity, has one specific group that they're really pushing, whereas they're less concerned, if not totally against, another group. And it makes it challenging. And I think we do need to have a very civil, respectful dialogue about it. That one of America's key strengths is equal opportunity, not that everybody gets the same stuff in the same amount at the same time.
It's equal opportunity, not equal outcomes.
Yeah.
And so I would just say this, and this will maybe cause more problems, but you guys will fix it later. I think that you can't really have a full appreciation of diversity until you have a fundamental, and I'll use a philosophical term, a priori commitment to unity. I worry that America will fragment unless we have a defining moral center of what it means for America, which, for instance, is a land of equal opportunity.
Yeah.
If we have a view of diversity that only lifts up our differences, I think we're doomed to fragmentation. If we have a view of diversity that begins with the fact that we have some fundamental values, for instance, as Americans. By the way, if you run a company and your company produces widgets, I expect your company to have some value and mission statements about widget making.
Yeah.
And those people who work in your company, you have the right to believe that they are for the unifying principle that is the mission and vision of your company. And if not, they shouldn't work there. So I feel like diversity that's not built on a foundation of unity is sort of destined to lead to fragmentation and destruction.
I think that's very wise.
Now you're going to get all kinds of angry hate mail, but it's been a fun talk.
Yeah, bring it on. But that's part of unity. So anyway, but I mean, if we're preaching unity, I don't like to use the term preaching, but if we're advising, recommending, encouraging unity, and we get attacked for that, you can bring that on all day long. I mean, that's just, we need to do that. We need people to find a way to work together. As you know, John, I've got a passion in this area with, my simple liberty thing and 3 common values for America, and one of them is equal opportunity for all. And that has to be a core tenet of how we work together. And I think you're right, whether it's at a university or at a company, having these values and requiring that people live them out. They're not just on the wall. You know, when we hire, we test for values. So there's a guy, Norm Brodsky, he writes a column for Fast Company or Inc. or one of the magazines. And I recommend it in my Hire the Best system. And as I work with people, he hires for positions, and he stated in the column that I read, he expects to interview 20 people, maybe 25, to fill one seat, which sounds so painful, right? But the first part of his interview he does is he will spend up to 30 minutes just talking about their culture to determine, is this person going to fit in? Is there going to be unity? Is there a match? So he watches. Are they falling asleep during those 30 minutes where he's talking about culture and he's sharing success stories? Are they engaged? Are they asking questions? Are they indifferent? Based on that piece right there, he either advances the interview or he ends it.
Wow. So good.
Saves a lot of trouble later on.
Yeah.
So there's kind of a disparity that's occurring to me right now. Right now, I'm reading that book about Lincoln, but last year I read the book about Steve Jobs by, I believe, Walter Isaacson.
Isaacson, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was great. And it really brings something poignant to my mind right now, in that people at Apple, the people that are working for Apple, were not necessarily civil. Jobs himself is notorious for not being civil, but he rallied his people around a common cause. And through his uncivility, actually was able to weed out a lot of people who maybe were not as committed to that cause as they should have been. So is there some sort of balance between, a civility and purpose that people need to find on their own?
Let me take a stab at something. I'm not an Apple expert, but I did read the book, and I have stayed in a Holiday Inn. So let me take a stab at something. I think there were people inside of Apple who stuck with Steve Jobs in the midst of his incivility, who saved Steve Jobs from Steve Jobs. And here's what I mean by that. In other words, I think Johnny Ive was the classic designer guy who really moved Apple forward in many ways. I think that Steve Jobs would berate the engineers, he would berate the various folks, he would have this reality distortion field and all the other stuff, and the incivility would happen. I think there were people that could ultimately save Steve Jobs from Steve Jobs, because left to his own devices, I think he might have left, burnt carcasses down every hallway. But I think there were moments where there were people that Steve Jobs gave enough grace to, gave them positional authority that they ultimately could back him off his worst instincts. And I think Steve Jobs is a genius. I think he brought into being some products and movements that might not have happened without him. But I think he had a team of amazingly gifted people around him. And so I think there's an edge to civility that ultimately can destroy even genius around you. And I think Steve Jobs was protected from himself by a few close people who stuck with him through the whole time. They're committed enough to Steve Jobs' genius to help him to not destroy himself or the company. And if there's any Microsoft fans out there, can I give you a quick little story?
Shoot it. Go for it.
Okay. So if you're an Apple raving fan, I'm for you. I use a lot of Apple products. I just want you to know this. Bill Gates makes $100 million loan to Microsoft does to keep Apple in business. Absent Bill Gates, Apple goes out of business. That was in the first incarnation of Steve Jobs. So I just want you to know there's a place for Microsoft in the world, place for Apple in the world. We need them both. And Bill Gates is a genius. Steve Jobs is a genius. Their genius operated in different ways. And I think there's a good life lesson there.
Well, I think also you guys were talking about team of rivals. And so I don't mind saying it on a podcast. So we had in our last presidential election a choice between Hillary or Trump. And I didn't like either of them. And I could, argue that both of them belong in jail. However, when I looked at Trump, I thought, here's a businessman. I don't think he's the sharpest tool in the shed, but I think that he will surround himself with people that will give us a better government than the type of people that I think Hillary would surround herself with. So this team of rivals type of thing, talk about somebody who can be self-destructive with Trump, with his tweets and whatever. But I think he has surrounded himself with people, and some of those people are very smart and have high integrity and are really trying to do the right thing. And, kind of similar thing.
I love that great point and maybe this is where civility comes. Are you secure enough as a leader in whatever role you have, to surround yourself with people with whom you disagree, but who are geniuses at what they do, whatever field you're in. Can you surround yourself and be secure enough with people with whom you disagree? I think that may be the genius, both to Lincoln, the team of rivals, as well as Steve Jobs or anybody else who is kind of known for some measure of incivility, but at least they were secure enough to surround themselves with some really strong people.
Yeah, and if you're surrounding yourself with people that only agree with you, I mean, you're in trouble. It doesn't work.
That's right.
That's the one thing that stuck out to me about Jobs, is that he was so mean to people that eventually some people the good ones, the really good ones, got so fed up with it that they just threw it right back at him.
Yep.
and then Jobs he respected their opinion. He respected people who stood up to him and told him he was, full of it.
Yep. But there's a certain level of security there that Jobs had to be willing to take that from a few people apparently who were strong enough and who he trusted enough.
Yeah.
Well, I think that we've talked about a lot this podcast. We can wrap it up. John, thanks so much for joining us today. Any final thoughts for business leaders, church leaders, anybody running a university?
There we go. I just say this. This kind of conversation is always helpful to me. Tomorrow morning, I'll have in my office 6 other college presidents, and we commit to about 3 times a year just hanging out for 3 or 4 hours together and having these kinds of conversations. They always go on a far-ranging array of topics. I just encourage people, be learners, lean in, have these conversations, and thank you guys for hosting this podcast and the conversation, and hopefully it stimulated some good thoughts for your listeners.
Hopefully. We'll keep it going. Hopefully we can have you back in the future.
Hey, thanks so much, John. As usual, I feel like we're just getting started. So I think we need the 3 or 4 hours, but thank you so much. We look forward to having you back again. Appreciate all that you do there at Jessup and the other things that you do with other people. That you're doing awesome stuff and making a big impact.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Jeff.